I am excited to have a special guest with us today. His name is Luke Thompson. He's worn a lot of hats in his lifetime. He has been a philosophy professor. He also has worked as a pastor. He also is an author and now is also a professor of theology. He's thought a lot about many different issues and so happy to share his wisdom. He's also author of the book, Your Life Has Meaning, and so much wisdom in that book. And we'll talk about that more. This is an important topic because going through fibromyalgia can be very frustrating. If this is your first time listening to the podcast, you're unfamiliar with fibromyalgia. It's a chronic pain condition where there is also a lot of fatigue and brain fog, and it can be very frustrating. Living with this suffering of chronic pain can be very challenging. Making sense of it all and trying to have hope can be difficult. In your book, you talk about how we think about life, and listeners of the podcast come from all different philosophical and theological frameworks. We often get caught up in everyday life and don't take time to consider the bigger overarching picture of life. Can you share just some general different spiritual paradigms, the ways to understand the world and how that applies to enduring suffering and pain?
Absolutely, Mike. And thank you very much for having me on. I'm very excited to be here with you. And I'm very glad that we can make this happen. This has been a while that we've been trying to set this up. Yeah. So just in regards to different spiritual paradigms, if we're going to just boil this down as much as possible into something easy to wrap our heads around, yet at the same time understand the implications, there was an atheist philosopher named Jean-Paul Sartre, famous existentialist atheist philosopher, and he basically separated philosophical and, for that matter, spiritual worldviews into two categories in one of his kind of infamous essays. And what he said was he compared his atheism to St. Augustine and St. Augustine's Christianity, so his theism. And Sartre said that the big difference between him and Augustine was that Augustine, once upon a time, said that essence precedes existence. And what Augustine meant by that is that if there is a God, then the essence, your essence, my essence, existed before we actually physically existed in this world. We might think of it something like this. Imagine you've got a carpenter that's making a chair. So if the carpenter is making the chair, before he even begins work on the chair, does the chair actually exist? We might say it hasn't been brought into physical existence, but the essence of the chair already exists, right? Where would you say that's at? It's in the mind of the carpenter, right? The carpenter has in his mind the chair that he wants to create, and then he goes through the act of bringing it into existence, right? And so he's got the chair in his mind, and he's got reasons that he wants to make the chair. There's purpose behind it. There's all these different reasons that he's bringing the chair into existence, and it's all right there with the essence of the chair before he actually creates it. Sartre says if God does not exist, then that means Augustine has to be wrong with this essence precedes existence. Instead, what must be the case then is that existence precedes essence. And so he kind of switches those around. And what Sartre meant by that is there can't be a God who has first thought of us and brought us into existence. Instead, we just come into this world existing. And there was nothing before. There was no mind that wanted to bring us into this world. We just now exist. And now that we find ourselves existing, we now create our own essence. And we're going to do this through the choices we make. And so Sartre was very big into taking seriously the choices that we make as human beings. And this feels very empowering, this idea that I can just kind of shape who I am and my own identity through all the choices that I make. But once we do that, once we take this step and say that my essence is something that I shape myself, then what we're actually saying, the real consequence of this is that we're saying then that my existence really doesn't have any transcendent meaning to begin with, right? Instead, An evolutionary atheistic explanation would say I'm just an accident of the universe, right? I'm just the product of some determined causes or something like that. But there was no mind that brought me into this universe. And so I come into this universe with no purpose, no meaning, no transcendent value. What this also means then is that when we're looking at suffering and we're looking at pain, these two worldviews then, atheistic worldview versus St. Augustine's Christian worldview, what we have then between the two of these things is it's not just that you and I would have an essence and then be brought into this world, but pain and suffering has this same thing. In Sartre's atheistic framework, all pain and suffering is pointless. There's no meaning behind it. We are just creatures that exist. And then the pain and suffering is just a consequence of it. And there's no rhyme or reason behind it. That's just the way life is. On Augustine's level, though, there's certainly pain and suffering, right? And we take that very seriously, but it's meaningful pain and suffering. Somehow there's some larger story. There's some reason that we've been brought into this world. There's a reason that the Creator has created us. And there's a reason that He's put us in this world, including the context that we find ourselves in. And so our purpose in life isn't to create our own meaning. Instead, in Augustine's worldview, our purpose is to find out what that meaning is, that there's some transcendent purpose behind it. And life's goal is to discover that. And that goes along with the pain and the suffering that we're going through in life. This is not meaningless. It's not pointless. There's some reason behind it all. And then we're striving to find that reason, as opposed to Sartre, where it's just pointless. There's no rhyme or reason behind it. And I just have to come to grips with the meaninglessness of it all. So that's maybe one way of setting the two apart. I know we just dove right into the deep waters pretty quick there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is kind of, and there's so many different levels in between. And a lot of people often may go back and forth between these,
right,
and haven't even put a lot of thought even to these situations. Probably both groups may agree that there is a function, pain as a function to alert us that we could be injuring ourselves and those kind of things. And the attribution of that from a very simple standpoint may be time, chance, or there's a designer behind this. There's a creator who put all of these in there. And then there's a suffering that can come across as meaningless because why? Why am I going through this? In your book, you talk about the word metanarrative. That's not a word that most people are using on a casual conversation. Tell us more about what a meta-narrative is and why everyone needs to consider it, even if they don't consciously subscribe to one.
Yeah, so I think the concept of a meta-narrative is an extremely powerful idea. And again, if we're thinking about Augustine's essence preceding existence, right? So you've got God who has in mind something that He is bringing into the world, right? And so what the meta-narrative is then, it's this overarching story, we might say, or this overarching grand idea that we would fit all the other ideas into. Maybe one way of thinking about it would be like this. So imagine you are reading a really big book. What's the biggest fiction book that you've read, Mike? Or just name a big one.
I just got done reading the Gone with the Wind.
Okay,
I did a podcast on that. So that was probably one of the longest books I've read.
That's on my list. Yeah, that's on my list. What are the names of the two main protagonists in it?
Scarlett O'Hara and the other famous love of his life actress, or I should say the main character in there, and going through her life. Very good book.
So imagine you're reading Gone with the Wind. Imagine you haven't started reading it yet. And instead you just flip open the book to one chapter somewhere in the middle of it. There's probably like 100 chapters in Gone with the Wind, right? It's huge, right? So you go to one chapter or maybe 5-10 pages right in the middle of the book, and you read those 5-10 pages. You've never read the beginning or the end. You've only read those 10 pages. Would you have any idea what's going on?
It'd be hard to figure it out.
Yeah. Would you have any idea whether the characters are making good decisions or bad decisions?
You couldn't know.
Why not? Why
The
not?
context of what's going on, the situation, the background leading up to that circumstance. You don't know who they are and why they're there, how they're interrelated to everybody.
So you need the larger story. You need the meta story that those few pages, whatever kind of storyline right there is in. You would need the larger context, some idea of what's going on in order to judge anything that's going on in that chapter, particularly in order to judge the actions of the individuals in the chapter, whether or not they're making good or right decisions. Imagine all you knew was just the few years that you are on the earth, but you don't know anything else. How could you possibly decide what you're supposed to do? What actions are the right actions to do, the wrong actions to do in life? But if your life is part of a much larger narrative, right? If your narrative is part of a much larger grand meta narrative, if you could know what that meta narrative was, what that overarching grand story was, then all of a sudden you'd be able to understand a lot more about who you are, about what it means to live a good life, about what the trajectory of this meta narrative is, and so what your role might be in that narrative, where you're heading, where you want to head. All of a sudden, you'd maybe understand your vocation a whole lot better, right? And the reason why you should be doing the things that you do in life. And so a meta narrative has the ability to infuse your life with meaning. But if there's no meta narrative, right, if we go back to maybe a Sartrean view of things, right, if existence precedes essence, and there's literally no meta narrative, then that means, in a kind of transcendent or cosmic sense, there is literally no story for your life. There's really no reason behind why you're here, and there's no way to tell how you ought to live your life. And then when it comes down to the experiences that you have in your life, right, go back to your Gone with the Wind book, the trials and tribulations that might happen in those 10 pages, you'd have no idea how to judge them, right? But the larger meta narrative would tell you those trials and tribulations, if it's a good author anyways, right? They would tell you whether or not those were meaningful and how those trials and tribulations that the characters went through served the greater arc of the story. And if it's a good story, how it served the good ending. And that's ultimately what we would say like a Christian meta-narrative gives. It gives this larger overarching context to not only my identity and what I should do with my life, but also my experiences. Because then I know that whatever experiences I'm going through, whatever pain and suffering I'm going through right now, it's not accidental, it's not pointless. Somehow there's a storyteller that's weaving this into a much larger story. And there's a reason behind it. I might never figure out the reason, but there's a reason behind it. I know there is, if I know the meta-narrative.
In your book, tell us about who Solomon was, his background, and how he looked at life, because as you said in your book, there are a lot of some atheists who really enjoy reading it because they found in some way maybe some solace or at least recognition of resonance in what could be perceived as some common beliefs.
So the title of my book was Your Life Has Meaning. And what the book, a meditation or a commentary on this 3,000-year-old book written by a Middle Eastern philosopher named Solomon, who says, meaningless, meaningless, everything is meaningless. Everything under the sun is completely meaningless. And so it's this book that begins with those words. And what's particularly interesting to me as a Christian is that this book is part of the Christian canon. It's called Ecclesiastes, and it's an Old Testament book, and it's this incredibly insightful book. So what you have here is someone that believes in the Christian God before Christ, and he is saying that all things are meaningless. Now, what could he possibly mean? How in the world could Solomon, this writer of the Bible, say everything is meaningless? So Solomon, traditionally, if you're looking at the biblical accounts, just straight up as you read them right off the pages, Solomon was the son of King David, who was a famous guy, a big guy in the Old Testament. And Solomon was incredibly famous for being incredibly wise. So he had this great intelligence, and he used this intelligence then to get tons of wealth. He was one of the wealthiest people around at the time, to get tons of wives. He was famous for having just tons and tons of wives and concubines. He used this for tons of huge building projects. He used his wisdom to amass tons of knowledge about nature and animals and things like that. And this is all recorded in the Bible for us in the Old Testament. And so he did all of these things with his life, but he also used all this wisdom to not only chase after all these other things, but also to chase after idols. And so even though he knew that this wisdom that he had received was a gift from God, he instead decided to spend his life chasing after all of these things and totally ignore his faith. In fact, reject it and instead chase after idols. Ecclesiastes, then, is this book that I think only makes sense if we read it as Solomon, as an old man, looking back at his life. He's now realizing what he's done with his life. That by ignoring the meta-narrative, by living as if there is no overarching story, his technical term for it is living under the sun. If we're just living as if, as the world reveals itself to us, he says everything is meaningless. It was completely pointless that I amassed all of this wealth. It's completely pointless that I amassed all of this knowledge. It's completely pointless that I amassed all of these wives. In fact, like, that's a pretty horrible thing that he did, as far as however you want to view the Middle Eastern polygamy at that time, right? Just kind of horrible stuff. He spent lots of stuff on kind of warmongering things as well. He's just looking at all this, and man, like, it was just all meaningless. Everything I did in my life was meaningless because I was not doing these things as if there was a God who had an overarching story and that had a purpose for me within this story. And so Ecclesiastes is looking back at all of this. And so it's him saying everything is meaningless under the sun. But then there's these transitional moments in the book then when he says, let's remember our Creator. And when we remember our Creator, all of a sudden everything gets reinfused with this meaning and value. And so I think it's just an incredibly powerful book, because you have this, what I would call an inspired writer of the Bible, that is saying without God, everything is meaningless. And what's interesting is that's exactly what Sartre says. That's exactly what Nietzsche, an atheistic philosopher, said. Many philosophers agree with this 3,000-year-old Middle Eastern philosopher, that everything is meaningless if existence precedes essence.
Speaking of Nietzsche, you wrote in your book his Madman parable. And
Yeah.
Can you tell us what that's all about? Because I think that is very interesting, and I think he's sometimes misunderstood for God is dead. But can you share that parable? I think there's a lot of wisdom.
Yeah. So as far as the kind of diagnosis I'm making that life is meaningless without there being a God, I did not come to this conclusion just because I'm a Christian. There are many philosophers that have come to this conclusion. And one of the most famous ones to acknowledge this and just openly embrace it and say, what are we going to do about this condition, was Friedrich Nietzsche. So Nietzsche was a philosopher that lived he especially did a lot of his writings at the end of the 1800s, right at the turn of the century. And he's famous for popularizing the phrase, God is dead. What's interesting is that he came up with this phrase and made it popular, not because he was trying to convince anyone God is dead. He already assumed that all the intelligentsia and everyone would agree with him. Instead, he came up with this term, God is dead, because he wanted to warn people about what the implications of this were. And the phrase comes up in a very famous parable that he writes about. The parable comes up in a couple of his works, but the kind of gist of it goes something like this. There's this madman that runs into a marketplace, a town square, and he runs into it in the middle of the day, but he's got a lantern on, and he rushes into the crowd, and he's running around saying, where's God? Where's God? God is dead. And as he runs into the crowd and says this over and over again, God is dead, we've killed him, everyone laughs. Everyone around him is laughing at him. The reason they're laughing at him is not because they're laughing at him saying God is dead. They agree with that. They're laughing at him because he thinks this is a problem. Everyone else already agrees that God is dead, but they see this guy as crazy for thinking that there's any reason to be alarmed with it. And so the madman goes on And here's just a couple of lines from what he says. So he says, "So where is God? I will tell you, we have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers. But how did we do this? How could we drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What were we doing when we unchained this earth from its sun? Whither is it now moving? Whither are we moving? Away from all suns? Are we not plunging continually, backward, sideward, forward, in all directions? Is there still any up or down? Are we not straying as through an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not become colder? Is not night continually closing in on us?" And so Nietzsche, this madman, is trying to describe what the implications are that God is dead. And what he's getting at here is the fact that through the Enlightenment movements that were taking place, the use of God in the sciences and in ethics and in politics, God was just taken out of all those things. There was no longer a need for him, according to Enlightenment thought. And so we don't need God to do politics, right? So we don't need to believe in him anymore. We don't need him to do ethics. Kant and others demonstrated that we can do ethics reasonably without God. We don't need him in the sciences anymore, right? You can be a scientist going about your business without needing God to explain anything. And so God is, for all intents and purposes, dead to us as a culture. But what did we lose when that happened? And Nietzsche's language then is that we have been unchained, right? This earth has been unchained from its sun, and we are now plunging into this continual infinite darkness. And his point here is that we have now taken away the foundation that justified so many of the things that we took for granted. So ethics, for example, how in the world do you decide what right and wrong is if there isn't this meta-narrative, right, that we were talking about? If there is no God and so there's no meta-narrative, then how can you know in this moment what you ought to do with your life, right? So we've removed all of these structures and all of these foundational aspects that we need in order to know how to live. The madman's supposed to be a prophet. He comes before his time. Everyone's fine with it at that time that God is dead. But Nietzsche was saying a time is coming when we're going to see how problematic it is that we no longer have God to be the source of our identity, to be the source of our ethics, to be the source of our meaning. We're going to have to somehow try to construct all these things for ourselves. And Nietzsche knew that you just simply can't construct ethics, right? You just can't simply construct meaning. These are not the types of things that you can do on your own. You need a God to do it.
But we do try to find meaning and purpose. And one of the things you wrote in your book was a question that was given by a 6-year-old to Neil deGrasse Tyson. He's a science and physics popularizer, and gave a question on the meaning of life to him. And he said, "I think people ask the question on the assumption that meaning is something you can look for and then, oh, I found it. And it doesn't consider the possibility that maybe meaning in life is something you create. And so when I think of meaning in life, I ask, am I learning something today that I did not know yesterday, bringing me closer to knowing all that can be known in the universe? If I live a day and I don't know a little more that day than the day before, I think I wasted that day. Your meaning in life will be enhanced if you are given as much freedom as you can to explore the world. Then, when you get older, you will become so close to how the world works that when a problem arises that needs a solution, you will say, I know how to solve that. I've been thinking about that before. You owe it to yourself and everyone else to stay curious. And by doing so, you have created meaning in life that others think is waiting for them under a rock for them one day. And you would have made it happen on your own." So what is Tyson saying, and what are the implications? And did Solomon consider the same question?
Yeah. So what's interesting here is that someone asks Tyson, what's the meaning of life? And Tyson makes this interesting distinction right off the bat. He says, some people think it's something that you need to look for and then say, I found it. Well, that's exactly what I said at the beginning of our talk, right? That if there is a God, then our goal in life is to find out what our meaning is, right? To find out why we were created and what role we have to play in this universe. He then goes on and says it doesn't consider the possibility that maybe meaning in life is something you create. And so we've got two different kinds of meaning here, and they're not the same. And I don't know if Tyson understands the difference between them or not. So on the one hand, we have what we'll call cosmic meaning. And so cosmic meaning or transcendent meaning, this is the idea that whether or not I know it, there is some type of overarching meaning to this universe. There's some reason that it's here. Maybe I don't know it, but it's there regardless, right? And a lot of times when people are asking, what's my purpose in life? Why is it all here? That's what they're asking for, right? They're asking for some type of transcendent answer. They want to know what the transcendent story is that explains why we're here. Now, of course, if the evolutionary atheist is right, then there is no reason that we're here. There's literally nothing that we can talk about. We may talk about causal things like there was a big bang or something like that, but those are just purposeless causes, right? They're mindless causes. They're unreasonable causes. There's no one reasoning behind them, right? So we would just say we're not here for any purpose. What we could also talk about, though, and which is a very valid way of talking about meaning, is what we might call short-term meaning. So my son right now has gotten into collecting coins, and he thinks that it is just the coolest thing in the world that he can find this nickel that his neighbor thinks is 5 cents, and his neighbor gives it to him, and he looks it up and he finds out that actually this nickel is worth like $15 or something like that. So the question is, how can this nickel be worth $15? Why is it actually worth $15? And what's the answer to that? How could
somebody else finds it more meaningful?
Yeah, right. Someone is willing to pay $15 for it, right? Someone is willing to pay $15 for a nickel. That's the only reason that it's worth $15. So someone has given value to that nickel. And because of that, nickel does have the value of $15. But if that person that values it for $15 gets hit by a bus, and he's the only person in the world that valued it for $15, then that nickel would be worth a nickel again, right? So we can value things, and then they do have that value. But we call that a short-term value or short-term meaning because it can go away. It doesn't have to be around forever, right? Cosmic meaning, this is something that's built into the fabric of the universe. It is there from when the universe is created to whenever it's going to end. Short-term meaning is the type of meaning that is something that will not last that long. It's only going to last as long as the people that have given it meaning last. And so I could ask you something like, do you have any kids, Mike?
3 kids.
Yeah.
2
right.
teenagers.
All right. So imagine, so would you say that, I don't know, do you have a daughter?
Yes.
Let's say your daughter. Would you say that daughter has value?
Yes.
Okay. Now, where does her value come from? Do you think she has value because you value her? Or do you think she would have value regardless of whether you were around?
Whether or not I was around.
Yeah. And I have yet to meet someone, I've yet to meet a parent that would say that my child only has value because I value them. You talk to most moms and dads, and they will say, man, my child has value. Even if I was to get hit by a bus tomorrow and no one else values this person, I know that child has value. So what kind of value, what kind of meaning are we talking about at that point? If we're saying that this person has a value that is not determined on other people valuing him or her, then that can't be short-term meaning, because that would only be around for the amount of time that people are valuing that person. If it's true that this person has value, whether or not any other human being values them, then somehow that value we're talking about has to be a transcendent value. It's coming from somewhere else, right? There's something special about that person, right? And a Christian would say the reason that every single human being has value is because the God of the universe created that person. And the reason that they created them is because the God of the universe wants to have a relationship with that person and things like that. But it comes from the outside, and that's what gives the individual value. But if you take away the meta-narrative, then you're left with only short-term value. And that really goes against the types of things we're talking about. And at the end of the day, all Tyson is talking about here is just pragmatic stuff, right? He's saying there's a problem, I can learn how to fix that problem. But he's not actually asking the deeper questions. Should you fix that problem? Is there any reason that a scientist ought to have to do the work of science? You might say a scientist just wants to do it, but that's not the question. The question is, should the scientist want to do it?
Yeah. And I think much wisdom that Tyson is saying is that we're curious. We want to learn things. That's part of probably every doctor that decided to go and become a doctor, wherever their paradigm is, wanting to solve problems on a very pragmatic standpoint and help people and understand things. That's part of the podcast, the book. One of my missions is to help share hope and meaning and some observational science and understanding what we know to help people get through these. So,
and so here's the big question, though. Here's the big question, though, right? So is it good that scientists are curious? Is that a good thing?
And I would say, yes, that's a great thing.
And I don't know anyone that wouldn't. Why, though? Why is that a good thing? If there is no meta-narrative, if there's no larger reason, if we're literally just the products of chance, then our curiosity is just as much the product of chance. And there's nothing special about our curiosity. It just happens to be this interesting thing that's happening right now at this point in the history of the universe. But given maybe like a Christian meta-narrative, there's an awful lot we can say about that curiosity and why it's good, right? That somehow the creative nature, right, and curiosity is tied to the idea of creativity, right? Wanting to explore and to manipulate your environments and to learn and things like that. That creativity reflects somehow the nature of God himself. And that's the Christian idea, that we're image bearers somehow of God, that there's aspects of our character that reflect him. And so the Christian has the ability to say that the curiosity of the scientist is divine, right? That this is not just like good in a pragmatic sense, but it is beautiful and it is special that humans have this, because when they are carrying out their curiosity as scientists or philosophers or architects, engineers or programmers, they are carrying out a function that God has given them and that reflects his nature as a person. That's incredibly satisfying compared to this is just something that happened at this point of history in a meaningless universe.
And so much wisdom that you shared there and putting it into perspectives. One of the goals that I have is to help people understand who are going through suffering. And in your book, you talk about remember your creator. Since I went through medical school, the first part of medical school, the first year, is spent on physiology, which is the normal functioning of things and design of things. And then the second year is mainly spent on pathophysiology, all of the dysfunction that can happen. And that's part of trying to solve problems in the understanding of what fibromyalgia is and how the brain processes pain. And for just a review for those who have not heard all of the podcasts or read my book yet, it's the brain listens to these different stimuli, and things that aren't necessarily causing tissue damage feel like they are. People who have normal gas in their intestines, it feels like it's extremely painful and it's stretching and going to explode their intestines, but it's really irritable bowel and they're just hypersensitive. People can be having migraines and they're hypersensitive to light and sound and smell. But there's a normal bell curve of where somebody's sensitivity is, but things get shifted. Something that is meant to be a protective thing and a good thing designed ends up getting shifted. And you can't help when you look at so many back and forth feedback mechanisms that are going on in just one aspect of one simple system. There are multiple systems coordinating to get the idea that this happened by just time and chance is really a hard one to connect because there is an incredible thought. Yet, for those who are suffering, it really is painful to go through experiences where they are really suffering. One of the other things that you mentioned in your book is how to find meaning. One is that short-term meaning. And some people have found a lot of meaning and pleasure and enjoyment in the good things in life. And can you share some thoughts that Solomon had with that and how that applies in the short term, but then applying to people who may be going through pain and suffering?
Yeah. So there's a couple points in Ecclesiastes where Solomon talks about certain things. And he says, this is great. It's great that we're able to do these things. And he celebrates certain things. And he does this with pleasure as well, where there's points where he says it's wonderful to enjoy the pleasures of life. And we might think of things like eating good food and having friendships and all of these great things. What's interesting is that after he acknowledges that these are good things, then he says, but then, when I've looked back on it, I realize that these things are meaningless as well. It's meaningless because I'm looking at it under the sun. And so when we approach things like pleasures in life, we have to ask ourselves, why are we approaching these things and what are we hoping to get out of it? Because if we think that the reason that I'm going to pursue these pleasures is because there's going to be some way that I will be able to get an identity out of it, then ultimately you're just reducing your life to a Facebook stream of like your happiest moments and things like that. Is that really all you are as a human being? Is just a collection of thoughts? But on the flip side, then how do you deal with the fact that there's pain and suffering in this world, right? Because if you're trying to simply say that the good life is only a life of pleasure, then you're going to be disappointed, right? It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter what you're doing in life, but everyone suffers. Everyone goes through hardships. And no matter how hard we try to keep ourselves from suffering, it's going to be there. And so if you're saying that my identity is going to be built only on the good, pleasurable things I have in life, then you are just constantly going to be falling off that because life is just hard and life is difficult. It always comes back to the question, is the pain and suffering that I'm experiencing in this life, is it pointless or is it meaningful? When we read a good book has lots of pain and suffering in it, right? But what makes it a good book is that the pain and the suffering in it serve some greater good towards the end. That never makes the pain and suffering somehow good, right? But somehow it gets transformed. The effects of the pain and suffering do not serve the purposes of evil. Instead, they end up serving the purposes of good. And the big question in life, is that what life is really like? Are the pains and suffering that I'm going through, are they completely meaningless? Is there no rhyme and reason behind it? Or is there some reason? Is there some overarching story that I'm a part of? And part of that story is that the pains and sufferings that I'm going through will be transformed into some greater good in the end. That's the Christian metanarrative at the end of the day. And it all hinges, what's really interesting about the Christian metanarrative is that it all hinges on a moment of suffering. All right, so at the very center of the Christian message is a point in time when someone goes through excruciating suffering, but that excruciating suffering is the thing that opens up the possibility for a good ending. And of course, I'm talking about Christ dying on the cross. Yeah.
And when you're working with people who are struggling with pain, and there are things that we can do to help, but not everybody gets better. There's a lot of people who are really struggling, and there are circumstances that even if I could be everybody's doctor who's listening and try to apply the best evidence and best practice with medicine, may not get better, or they might get incredibly better. I've shared stories of people who've gotten a lot better and trying to help shift their nervous system in a way that is more in the healthy range, that they're not overreacting. But they may, and we're all going to have some other thing that comes up. A mom got cured from lymphoma probably about 8-10 years ago, and about a year and a half ago, she got pancreatic cancer and died. We all are going to have something. And we had great doctors taking care of her in Milwaukee here who are great experts, surgeons. And part of me in medicine, when you decide, I have a son in medical school, and you decide what kind of doctor you want to be. And a lot of times you want to be a doctor where you can fix people. You can make people in the short term better, right? Somebody who's having a heart attack and you can put a stent in and you can rescue them. Somebody who's got severe knee pain with severe arthritis and you can put a knee replacement in, and they're so thankful. They're not maybe running 10 miles, but they're living better in pain. But I thought, why would somebody want to? This is the depressing. Pancreatic cancer is very hard, and some people do get cured from that, but it's a really hard one to go through. But somebody cared, somebody was touched and wanting to get better. And a lot of people who are struggling with fibromyalgia, I say that for most doctors, you're the patient that they don't want to see on their schedule because they've been to so many different doctors. Nobody's helping. They get brushed off. A lot of people around them and their family and friends think they're just hypochondriacs and they're faking things, but the pain is actually real as they go through that. When you look at dealing with pain and suffering, when you've been with, as a pastor, working one-on-one with people, and maybe share some counseling or support that you might have with somebody who's going through a tough situation and how you might approach that with them.
Yeah. So I'm a Christian. And so I would approach the situation completely dependent on where the person is spiritually. So if I'm dealing with a person, there's been many times where when I was a pastor, I would have members of my congregation that would have friends that were dying of cancer or something like that. And they would recommend that their friend it's about time you kind of sorted through some of this stuff spiritually, right? I developed these great relationships with people that were originally not Christian when I met with them. And so as they're going through hardships, my goal there is very plain and simple. I want to be able to tell them that the pain and suffering that they're going through, that they are not alone as they're going through this. Right. And the reason that they're not alone is because the pain and suffering of this world are not meaningless, that there is an overarching story. And so all of these things in life that we go through serve the overarching purpose of this story. And the grand overarching purpose of this story, if we're to put in the most kind of broad epic terms possible, is that we have the God of this universe finding a way of overcoming the evil of this world, what Christians call sin that's brought into this world. But in a very personal way, what we're talking about more than anything else is that there is a God that is searching for each and every one of us. C.S. Lewis once famously said that God whispers to us in our pleasures, but he shouts to us in our pains, as if through a megaphone. And what he meant by that is that the times we are most likely willing to listen to God are when we are going through harsh pain and suffering. The pain and suffering that we go through in this life, God allows that to happen to tell us as clear as possible that there is something wrong with this world. There is so much that's good and beautiful about it, but there is just clearly something broken about it. And at the heart of what's broken is you and me. Right? It's not as if all of the evil is out there. The evil is within me just as much. I am just as much a source of the pain and the suffering of this world through my evil actions as any other person out there. And if there is a God, man, a God that is holy and righteous and loving and created this world that he loves, and I'm a source of evil in this world, man, there must be a problem between me and this God. And so God had a solution for that. And so that's what we talk about, right? We talk about how there is a solution to not just the pain and suffering or the seemingly meaningless pain and suffering in my life that I'm going through, but also all of the psychological pain and suffering that I go through, the guilt that I feel for the things that I've done, right? And for the hardships that I've caused. There is a solution to that, right? And as Christians, we would say that comes straight from the forgiveness of Christ, something that he offers freely for us. So that's where I'm going, right? I'm talking about meaning and how meaning can only be found in this theological context. If I'm talking to a Christian, then we've got the meta narrative, right? We've got it there. And all I'm simply doing is I'm reminding them of the promises that God gives us in the Bible, his revealed way of telling us what he's done for us to get us through the hardships of this world. And I'm just reminding the person of that, right? There's some great passages. For example, there's a guy named Paul in the New Testament that says that God is working all things out for the good of those who love him, right? That God will never leave us or forsake us, and he's working all things out for our good. That is true if there is a meta narrative. The Christian meta narrative is true, right? That there is a God that is with us through the pain and the suffering that we go through. He will never leave us or forsake us, and he is working all things out for our good. So I might not be able to guess how he's doing it with the suffering that I'm going through right now. But if there's a God that loves me and has demonstrated that love for me by sending a savior for me through Jesus, if that is true, then I know that the pain and suffering I'm going through, that same God is somehow working this out for my good, that he's using it in some way to draw me closer to him, or using it in some way for me to be able to help the people in the lives around me, to serve other. I don't know. I've got no idea how he's doing it, but I know that he's using it for my good, and I can simply trust him. I can trust him because he's demonstrated he's trustworthy in all of these other ways. So the meta narrative, the framework that we can understand some of these powerful, what we would call gospel promises that the Christian finds in God's word.
And it's an incredible thing to consider if that isn't something you've thought about and haven't even maybe been aware of, that there may be an overarching meaning. Solomon at the end said everything was meaningless. All of these things were chasing, trying to help, trying to cure. He was a biologist, scientist. He was a great economist and great leader, and accumulated great wealth, and all of these things that we help in our short term. But all of those, if we're honest with ourselves, are short term. If this is it, if this is all there is, it's hopelessness. George Foster Wallace, famous author, wrote that in a speech. Everybody worships something. I think even those who may think they're not. Can you share the gist of what he said?
Yeah, I can't remember quite all of it off the top of my head. Yes, his famous commencement speech that he had given, where he's describing fish and waters, right, and things like that, I think. Yeah, but everyone worships something, right, at the end of the day. Yeah, I think that's spot on. We might think that we can live as if there is no God, but ultimately we're going to turn something into it. That's one of the great kind of Christian insights that we have, and even an atheist like David Foster Wallace recognized that. I think the big thing is some people say life without a meta narrative, I can do this, right? I can do this. It's liberating if there's no meta narrative. People feel that way because then I've got no one that's telling me what to do. I can shape things however I want. I can decide whatever I want. I can be whoever I want to be. That feels so liberating. Yet on the other hand, if we take philosophers, writers as well, Foster Wallace was very honest, just as much as Nietzsche was on this topic, then we are literally lost if there is no meta narrative. We are straying through an infinite nothing. It just becomes incredibly hard. There's maybe one, if I can read, if you're all right with it, just one extended quote from the book here. This was a study that I had an excerpt of in my book. And this study was, so as I was preparing and counseling for helping some individuals out with alcohol addiction, I picked up this great book on some of the psychology behind alcohol addiction and some ways of dealing with it. And in that, I came across this quote. The authors say, so now they're talking about another study. Michael Chandler and his associates at the University of British Columbia canvassed native communities through much of Western Canada. What struck them almost immediately was the astounding suicide rate among teenagers, 500 to 800 times the national average, infecting many of these communities, but not all of them. Some native communities reported a low of 0, true for 6 tribal councils, to a high of 633 suicides per 100,000. So 633 suicides per 100,000. That's incredible. That's incredible how high that is. What could possibly make the difference between places where teens had nothing to live for and those where teens had nothing to die for. The researchers began talking to the kids. They collected stories. They asked teens to talk about their lives, about their goals, and about their futures. What they found was that young people from the high suicide communities didn't have stories to tell. They were incapable of talking about their lives in any coherent, organized way. They had no clear sense of their past, their childhood, and the generations preceding them. And their attempts to outline possible futures were empty of form and meaning. Unlike the other children, they could not see their lives as narratives, as stories. Their attempts to answer questions about their life stories were punctuated by long pauses and unfinished sentences. They had nothing but the present, nothing to look forward to, so many of them took their lives. And so I think it's just crystal clear when you look at studies like this, what happens when you take large populations and you literally tear them out of their roots, right? Their geographical roots. They no longer live in a place that has their stories. And there's all these other things that go along with it. But you see clearly the implications if there is no meta narrative, right? Clearly, it is deeply important for us to think that we have a purpose, to know that there's some type of future, something to work towards, something, right, in life. You take that away, you can try to construct it for yourself. You can try to do that. But Nietzsche, he ended up going crazy at the end of his life. Now, maybe it wasn't strictly because of his philosophy. He had some medical things that he was dealing with as well. But it couldn't have helped him believing that somehow he had to construct his own new set of values, that somehow the fate of all meaning and value rested on his shoulders and him alone, that he had to somehow construct this stuff out of his will. No one wants that. No one wants that responsibility.
And I think the question that people who are going through things is why, and I try to, in my best, to try to give medical explanations. And a lot of this podcast, we're trying to give a lot of science and understanding of this, but the why implies that there's a purpose.
Yeah.
And that there's something that was supposed to happen. My daughter asked a question about heart disease on the way to school. One of her classmates has some kind of congenital heart disease she doesn't know much about. And she asked, why does that happen? What? And they're on a simple, something wasn't designed properly. But then you look at the end of my developmental biology class in med school, you learn about how you have an egg and a sperm come together and you get a human being developing through that. You learn how things happen. And then along the way, you learn about how things can go wrong. And at the end, he said, boy, we are fearfully and wonderfully made, in how that design, the language and DNA in putting things together, it came to the realization that why doesn't this happen more often? There's so many things that can go wrong. Designing, people who are architects trying to build things, and engineers, and all the steps that have to go, just taking off on an airplane and flying an airplane, landing, all the parts that have to be working smoothly. There's such evidence of a design. And there is this, we can maybe explain by just saying, we'll just say there isn't a designer. We've already excluded that, the late 1800s were, and continuing into this day, where we take that out, that's not a, well, why? And there isn't a deeper meaning. How do we get that connection? I think so much of our life can be just keeping really busy. And I think that reading through your book really helps to get people reading through it the second time. It helped look at life and perspectives and how we look at things. And that if there's more, like, what if maybe there is something more than the now and the here? And I think I haven't read a lot of literature on burnout, but you think of burnout in medicine, people going, nursing and nursing staff in ICUs, taking care of people who are dying from COVID when it was at the height. And that can be exhausting. People living with somebody who has fibromyalgia and not getting better is exhausting. Having this can be exhausting, and it's so easy to get burned out on life. And if you're trying to find these short-term meanings, but they're not there, and sometimes the pleasure in the world might have been when a spouse, the beauty and love a spouse has, but when they go through something, now that can be exhausting.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to in any way downplay the scientific why. That's so important. The fact that we are able to kind of learn the things that we can as far as why we go through the things. There was the Oxford mathematician, John Lennox. He's a Christian mathematician, philosopher type guy. He said, one of the things we need to realize, and so he's a scientist, one of the things we need to realize is really be careful about what kind of why question we're asking, because there's more than one kind of why. If I were to ask, why is there a combustion engine? We could put down the combustion engine and take it apart and see all the parts that work together. And that's one explanation for the combustion engine. But Henry Ford is another explanation, right? They're both explanations. And the explanation is incomplete unless you have both of them. And that doesn't mean that one explanation is better than the other, but it's incomplete unless you have the larger one. And I think this is just incredibly important for us to think about existentially, because when we go through suffering and when our friends are going through suffering, they are at times asking different why questions. Sometimes it's can I understand physiologically why this is happening to me? Can I figure out what's going on with my body? And is there anything that I can do about it once I get the explanation, right? The physiological explanation. That's only one kind of why, right? The deeper why, and maybe the more profound, why is this actually happening, right? Is there some purpose behind it? Or is this just a freak thing that's happening, right? Or is there some reason behind this? And we just need to be sensitive to that, I think. And we don't need to say that somehow one explanation is better than the other. We can love both of them, right? Yeah.
And I think as a doctor, it's fun answering the why questions on certain things. And that's why I share on the podcast. But sometimes there isn't a great solution and people are going through struggling in some perspective and wondering, you asking, what is the heart? Why do you ask? And I think sometimes, why do you ask that why question? What do you understand? And sometimes making assumptions where somebody's at, right? I'm sure when you've counseled with people, you ask, what's your understanding about things and the why and these things to see where they're at. Many people may have heard of some kind of meta-narrative and paradigm, and often there's this syncretic back and forth where we may identify as being spiritual, the mind, body, spirit connection. But what does that mean? And often there's borrowing of different meta narratives and philosophies that are intermingled without even knowing where those ideas even came from. It can be pretty sobering to consider some of these. And I think your book does a good job of, in a loving, caring, but also philosophical way, dissecting the effects or the types of philosophies and answering the bigger purpose. I think having a bigger purpose, that there is maybe a bigger cosmic narrative that in the short term, there may not be a solution. And that means short term, meaning while we're here, and that there is a bigger hope when people are going through. I like, as you learned with all the years of language that you've learned, even learned the Canadian language. Just kidding. When you were living in Canada, I interviewed one of my first podcast hosts guest was from Nova Scotia, and she had quite an accent, and I had a nice. But the despair, and that's, I think, flattened from without hope. And often when you're feeling without any hope, and that may be, what hope? Are we hoping for a fix here and now? And I've gotten a chance to work with patients to help them go through things and help them in the short term. And I love doing that. And I'm sure you love helping people connect the dots to a bigger hope in the long term. That's what you've dedicated your time to, helping understand people better and how they think. Philosophy is understanding how people think about things. And right, am I correct?
Yeah, technically philosophy is asking like the last questions, right? So again, thinking about maybe going back to the Neil deGrasse Tyson example there. So is it good to be curious, right? Yeah, everyone would agree with that. The philosophical question is why, right? Why is it the ultimate thing. Why is it good to be curious? Why is it a big deal that I'm suffering? Right? Ultimately, what can we ground the answer on?
And is it a good thing to help people?
Yeah. Yeah.
Is it a
Right.
good thing to care about other people who are maybe considered, if you're disabled with fibromyalgia? And those philosophies have been acted out in
Yep.
relatively modern history, going through what Stalin and Hitler and how their perspectives were acted out, and that if it's not,
Yep.
you're not utilitarian, it's not helpful. And yet, how do we make those standards on
Yep.
wrong, all of that? I've so enjoyed having you with us on the podcast. There's so much more, and I encourage listeners, if they can check out your book, I'll have links there. And if you're interested, Luke is willing, if you want to email him some questions or thoughts, I'll have his contact information there, and love for you to share some insights and thoughts, and maybe we'll have you back on another day. Any last thoughts or comments?
Just that for those that, are going through hardships, I think that they are just a good opportunity to slow down and ask the big questions. The atheist philosopher Albert Camus once said, the only time that we realize that if there is no God, life is meaningless, is when we stop working and when we just stop doing things and we have time to think. The problem with a lot of people that are going through very difficult medical hardships is they've stopped, right? A lot of times, and they just have a lot of time to think. And so I would say that's an opportunity, a huge opportunity to ask those big questions and to follow them and just take advantage of that opportunity that you have.
All right. Thank you
Yeah.
very much.